I do think the world probably needs more listening. If we do it better, things will go better. And part of that will be we'll feel more connection, and the time is right for that.
Despite all our devices, despite being connected literally 24/7, we're lonelier, we're more distracted, and less present with each other. That's why this conversation today matters.
Some people go in with an intention to solve a problem, for example. And it's because I'm listening through this intention of solving. But that may or may not be what my friend wants.
But the truth is, real listening isn't about just nodding your head or waiting for your turn to speak. It's about becoming genuinely interested in the other person, leaning in with curiosity instead of control. That's where real connection begins. My guest today is Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. He's an international leading researcher, best author, and executive coach. He's studied well-being and leadership across cultures, from Greenland to Kenya to India and beyond. And today, right here, right now, he's helping us recapture the art of listening in a distracted world. I highly recommend his latest book, Radical Listening. It is fantastic. This is the You Potential Podcast, where we explore meaning, mindset, and money through real stories and science. Please subscribe to the show, join us, because the world needs more connection right about now. Let's go. Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener, welcome kind of back to the show, to the new show.
Well, in some ways, definitely back. I mean, you and I have had
Yes.
a conversation in this context before, so we're back together.
We are back. I'm excited to chat with you. I shared with you before we started recording just how much I've referenced and read your work and your father's work. And having these conversations, I am definitely appreciative. Before we get into this wonderful book that you've written, amongst many other ones, I understand you like to draw. And something I am trying to do more is tap into my creative side. And so when I hear stories of other people doing the same, I'm deeply curious. So from what I read on the World Wide Web, and sometimes that leads us astray, but you like to draw as a morning routine to kind of get you in the rhythm of the day. And I'm wondering, as I'm reading this, to an outsider, it might sound like, you're doing simple sketches and just trying to occupy your brain. But I get the sense, especially someone like yourself, that there's something deeper going on here. What do those moments of drawing provide, Robert?
Yeah. What a kind of a delightful and certainly surprising opening question. So just as a little background, when I was a kid, I was pretty good at art. I was like, how in class you have like the fast kid and the kid that can draw and the kid that can play the piano. Well, I was the kid that could draw. And, I really enjoyed it and I drew quite a bit up until about the time I was maybe 20, 22, basically when I had my first child. And then I sort of like never drew again. It just evaporated overnight and I put it on the shelf for decades. And my family and I were traveling in Italy in 2018. And I was like, gosh, I just love the architecture here. And I did a couple little quick sketches of the architecture. And I'll tell you, in all honesty, they were pretty awful. Yeah, I mean, you might think they were okay, but it was clear that I had probably 2 or 3 decades of rust on me. But I was like, that's really enjoyable. And I'm very firmly in midlife. It might be cool to like brush this off and start doing it. And especially because then the pandemic happened just right after that. But I'm not a person that trifles. I don't like to try things, you're like, oh, try this new kind of food, try this new game, let's go to a new place. And I'm like, not really. And it's not really my reputation. People think I'm just going to be so open to everything. And I'm not. I kind of have to be dragged into stuff sometimes. So I was like, I'm only going to start drawing again if I can devote real time to it and get very good at it. Like I'm into excellence, not into trying things. I'm into like doubling down. So when I took it up, I just said, I'm going to draw if I can, every day for an hour. And I'm going to do that for 5 years. And I'll reevaluate it 5 years. But I don't want to do this for 6 months. Like, it's 5 years or nothing. I'm not just going to like come to your Taekwondo class and give it a shot one time. Like, I'm going to go for the black belt or nothing. So in the pandemic, it really was my well-being practice. Every morning I was drawing 1 hour, sometimes 2 hours. And I get up very early, sometimes 4:30 in the morning. The house is silent. It's still dark. My cat hangs out with me. And it was time to spend by myself. Sometimes I'm listening to music, sometimes to an audiobook. And so I got to improve. I got to be very mindful. I really was in flow the whole time, and it felt wonderful to me. And I'm not suggesting everyone should take up drawing because that might not be your thing, but it might be cooking for you or whatever it is. And so long as you devote yourself to it. And then I started taking vacations to draw. So I went to Hungary to draw the architecture. I went to Laos. I went, to a bunch of places. And you draw on the street, and it's a great way to meet people. Like, people will come up to you. And sometimes I do quick sketches and then I give it to the person. So it's just like ticking all these well-being boxes: social connection, personal improvement, flow, giving a gift, right? And making someone else happy, this kind of pro-social generosity. And now, and now I've kind of topped out. Like, I don't think I'm pretty good at drawing architecture. That's mostly what I draw. And I'm not really getting that much better. And it's been 7 years.
Wow. Yeah, that story, I felt like you were describing, you used the word flow and all those, I guess, domains of well-being as you explain this process. But you say you topped out. Are you still doing it, though, to get those inner benefits?
Oh, yeah. I didn't do it
Yeah.
this morning, but I did it yesterday and the day before. So, it's not every single morning, but it's very, very frequent. I take my sketchbook with me on vacation. I just was in Chicago last week, and I drew a couple sketches there, just like an alley with a bunch of dumpsters, and of a car parked underneath the L tracks, while I was sitting in a coffee shop. And it was just a very cool way to like really appreciate and notice the city around me.
Really interesting. And one point you said, like, I was at midlife, and it caught my attention because perhaps that's where I'm heading towards.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's this like reconciling or desire to come to ourselves at this midlife. And we hear midlife crisis where you get the sports convertible. And doing something like what you're doing, I got this whole like embodied feeling of, wow, it's like so accessible to everyone to experience this. Like, really, a pen, I mean, drawing pens are more expensive than the HP pens we grew up with, but they're still reasonably affordable. And of course, traveling is a different level, but it seems like many of these things are more accessible than we think to create this inner well-being.
Yeah, the thing that seems the least accessible about it is the time and the permission to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I admittedly, I put this on the shelf for decades. Even though I knew I was, had some natural talent for drawing, I knew that it would make me happy to draw, and yet I didn't do it. And I think people are doing this all the time. I'm not better than them, but I think people are, they've got this idea for a novel or a screenplay, or they always wanted to knit a hat, or, it could be a million different things. And they're just not doing it because the everyday business of living takes priority. And that can seem frivolous, I think, to us, to like do these more expressive kind of in the moment types of things. But I would say maybe at midlife, you change your attitude, with this back half of life in mind. You're like, maybe I ought to do some of the things that I value or that I'm good at or that express me or that leave a legacy or whatever. And maybe that would round me out nicely.
It's very interesting. You talk about like this lack of time, and I have 2 kids, and yes, mine are 9 and 6, and you feel like you have no time. But then you mentioned this crossover point. If it's at midlife or wherever, you start to realize, no, I really have a lack of time now. Like days until mortality exists. And I know for myself, it's starting to change that perspective.
Yeah, and I think it is perspective. And, I'm just as much victim as anyone else to it, but we all have the same amount of time. Like
Yeah.
we all have the 24 hours of the day. And I've always been sort of shocked, inspired by these people, like, I've got 2 young kids at home and I'm, working a busy job. And yet I wrote a novel on the side or whatever, right? Like, yeah, I had to stay up, between 11 and midnight every night for 3 years to do it or whatever it is. But you can just see that they valued it so much that they found a way. And I
Yeah.
find that quite inspiring.
When you said we all have the same amount of time, I saw a clip of a podcast from one of these like efficiency guru guys. And he's just like, you know what? I have more time than you. I split my days up into 3 different days. And he's like, I sleep half as much as time. And so I multiply that. I have 3 more times or 3 more years than you in a year. He's going on. The host was like, huh? Anyhow, well, I'm always interested in things that our guests are doing that are sometimes out of, I guess, the script that somehow we kind of have been downloaded to. These getting like the working the 9 to 5, so to speak. You fit in this mold. And as I was preparing for today and read a lot of your work and your father's, it seemed like your father was a master at this, like stepping outside the mold when it comes to researching happiness. I mean, I believe there was a few individuals like 100 years before him and even thousands of years before who are thinking this way, but not like scientists researching happiness to the level your father was, when I believe a lot of the feedback maybe was like, what are you doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what did you observe from your father in terms of stepping outside the mold, kind of going to your own rhythm in life?
Absolutely. This is true of my father, and it's true of many of the eminent social psychologists I know, the researchers, that they are essentially nonconformist in their thinking, and they're just creatives. I would describe them as creatives like stuck in a scientist's body. And I always saw that with my father. He grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, a huge farm. But that gave him access to a shop where he had welding tools and stuff. And as a little kid, like he made a flamethrower that was gas powered. And he had an
As kids
imaginary
do.
friend, and he tried to create like a hovercraft. And so he's just like, you could see that he was doing all these sort of like, he was just by himself thinking, he was creative, these flights of fancy. He figured out probability by rolling dice and charting it, and like totally charted probability, I think at a pretty young age, like 12. So he was pretty mathematically inclined. And he was very much a non-conformist. He had a knack for, well, if this is what everyone else thinks, what are the questions they're not asking? Because that's probably where the action is. Or when 2 people see the exact same thing in slightly different ways, there's probably something interesting there in the membrane between the 2 perspectives. And I saw that just constantly. I'll tell you a quick story of this.
Yeah.
The family was sitting by the pool one time. He had a pool when he was alive, and all the kids were swimming in the pool, and he was just like, I bet you we could figure out how much water one of these little floaty devices displaces. And he, for the next hour and a half, created sort of this fulcrum, this like seesaw device, and he took a known quantity, which was my son, and we knew my son's weight, and he was able to do this algebraic equation and put a cinder block on the other side till they achieved balance, and then he tied the cinder block to the floaty device until it reached neutral buoyancy, and like he was like, oh, it's like 15.5 pounds of water displacement. And that is exactly just how he saw everyday life. Like we go to the pool and we're like, cannonball. And when
Yeah.
he goes to the pool, that's what he was thinking. He might, in the middle of a dinner conversation, just, Shaun, if you got all the books in the world together, how much do you think they'd weigh? And that's, obviously not what you had been talking about, but that's clearly
Yeah.
what he had been thinking about while you were talking. um, and I found it very charming. I think many people did. And fortunately, I have a bit of that myself. And I think it leads to good research questions. Yeah.
It's so enjoyable to hear individuals who think in those ways, and in a way refreshing. And maybe again, I'm hitting this midlife and it's hitting me, but I spend a lot of time like thinking how I should think. And then I guess I'd make a very poor researcher, but yeah, it seems like we need some sort of motivation or mentor, or what's the word I'm looking, somebody like your father to ask us that question that sparks us in ourselves, be like, oh, wait, that is a brilliant question. And how can I embody some of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I like to lionize my father and hold creatives up, probably because I myself am a creative. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
probably an awesome way to be. But I recognize that society doesn't just need creatives. Society would be pretty poorly functioning if it was just all people that think like that. Like, I would never want my father to be working in the control tower directing air traffic, right? He would be like
Fair.
terrible at
Yeah.
that. So, if there are people who are more sort of regulated or inbounds thinkers, I think society needs that as well. It sort of needs all of us together.
Yeah. I could see your father as a plane is desperately trying to navigate these unexpected other planes, trying to ask them when he can land. And your father's like, before that, how much air is displaced when three humans cough at once?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
All right, so I want to get into your book, but this is something that's on my mind. And you mentioned your kids and your father's question around the kids. And I just see this epidemic of, whether even adults, this meaning crisis, this loneliness crisis, and
Mhm.
your father's childhood out on the farm where he's in a way bored. So he goes in the shop and builds a flamethrower. I remember being raised out in a small town and we just played with sticks. Sticks were bow and arrows. They were baseball bats. They were bats to hit my brothers with. And I see my own kids and I feel like at times I'm too strict with, like, you can't touch a screen. The thing is going to kill you. But what do you see is a balance for, I'm asking a parenting question now from the research, is how we can help this next generation, these young generation, embody that sense of boredom, creativity when we're battling against this invasion of technology and screens.
Yeah, I mean, big question, tough
Yeah.
question, and I don't want to pretend to any listener here like I have the answer. Like, oh, I'm glad you asked, Shaun, because
Yeah. Yeah. No, just perspective. Sorry. This is not about listening. I apologize.
no, but I just want to be a bit humble in what I offer because, I'm sure I have some thoughts on this, but I don't think once you hear my thoughts, you're going to be like, and that's what we should do. Like Robert has
That's right.
this
Yeah.
just knocked out of the park. Um, if you ask John Hay, who wrote The Anxious Generation, he is a big fan of free range kids, right? Which is what
Hmm.
many of us had in our childhoods. Like parents just send us out on our bikes or walking. And if you lived in a small town, maybe it's like go run through the cornfields. And maybe if you lived in a
Hmm.
big city, it was go to the empty lot and just play there or whatever it was. But it was sort of unstructured. And there's something about interacting with events as they come up, which is very different than, for example, the gaming world. And the gaming world has some exploration built into it, right? You can spend 50 hours in a video game exploring around, but it's highly structured exploration. You only go so far before the next challenge comes to you and you have to face the challenge. Now, I'm not anti-video game at all. I want to be clear about that. But there is something about facing uncertainty and improvisation that
Mm.
is lost in the technological world. There's not much improvisation in our interactions with AI. There's not, AI is never going to be like, oh, by the way, could I just stop the conversation for a second and point
Yeah.
out that an eagle just flew by? But that
Yeah.
that kind of improvised in the moment interaction is part of what offers the richness of human connection.
Yeah.
So, it's a spitball answer, but I think there's something there that is helpful. I was speaking with a researcher recently who suggested that because life is like a little bit more structured, and maybe there's other causes as well, but that young people are less risk prone. And
Mm.
there is a bit more like, if I can just follow the path, be in kind of think in bounds, play it safe. And you might find that across whether it's, in finance where you don't want people to be too loose, right? You want people to make smart, cautious decisions, or in research even where we would want people to ask bold, almost, totally out of the box questions. But we see more and more that young graduate students are asking kind of narrower, safer questions. I don't have huge data on this, but I think the more we can boot camp people into improvisation and risk, probably the better.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that, as you called it, spitball answer. But I take, you know, all answers. I love hearing different ways of thinking. But I wrote down here interacting with events as they come up. And, I just think of like a very structured childhood. You don't get that opportunity to improv. Again, something they brought up. So thank you for that. And my mind often likes to understand people's ways of being before they get to like their actual work.
Mhm.
And my last question until we get into the book is, so I understand you went to, I think it's the Caribbean island when your father went on a sabbatical.
Mhm.
I understand that's a great time for him to open up his mind and think about different ways and interact with unexpected events and improv. But how about yourself? As a child there for a year, have
Yeah.
you ever looked back and see how that has maybe impacted your ways of thinking today?
It was fantastic. So my father, up until that point, had studied crowd violence and crowd behavior, how mobs, you lose your identity in a mob, and, you get protesters that throw a rock through a bank window. But if they were by themselves, they would never do that. But sort of getting swept up in the moment and then they do it. So that was his field of study. But he really wanted to study happiness, which is almost like the furthest thing from crowd violence as you could possibly imagine. But he had to wait till he got tenure and his job was
Mm.
safe. And so he got tenure. He had studied enough crowd violence and he was like, great, I'm going to take a sabbatical, take a year off. I'm just going to read everything there is on happiness. And then I'm going to come back like swinging, just like I'm doing happiness research from now on. And this is in the early 80s. And my parents took me and my sisters out to dinner and they sat us down and they said, we're thinking about taking a sabbatical to a couple different places. We could go to Washington, D.C., or St. Thomas, which is an island in the Caribbean. Which would it be? And we were like, well, describe it to us. Like, well, what's it going to be like? And they drew two pictures on a placemat. The first picture was of these like townhouses in Washington, D.C., just like these brick buildings that were all completely like shoved together. And then the second picture was just a palm tree on the beach with the sea, And I'm like living in these like narrow brick houses or like being at the beach. Like, of course, we were like beach, beach, beach. And that's where we moved for a year. I had grown up previously until that point in a, medium-sized town in Illinois, which was, a pretty traditional place, kind of, yeah. And it really opened my eyes. I was like, oh, people live a completely different way. Like we drive on the left here.
Mhm.
Sometimes the power goes out. We have to catch rain in a cistern, so we have to be careful with how much water we use. You have to turn off the water in the middle of your shower while you soap up. You can't just let the shower run while you're soaping up. Like, you got to be a little more careful. Um, and I was just like, and this is what these people are doing every single day. I'm going to go back to Illinois where electricity is on all the time, but they're still going to be living like this. And we traveled quite a bit that year. We traveled to Haiti, to Peru, to Colombia. And this is in the
Mhm.
early 80s where there was definitely not good tourist infrastructure set up. We visited a tribe in the Amazon, and all of that together. I mean, it made me fall in love with culture, but it also just sort of, I would call it like an awakening where I'm just like, people are doing life in a very different way. And I had a sense, I think, even then that I don't think they're doing it wrong. I don't think people who drive on the right are superior to people who drive on the left, but just a real appreciation. And probably every single day since I was 9, since this time, I've spent some time thinking about what life in some other country is like. So like one of
Mhm.
them for me is like, I'm just like, right this second, what are people in Dubai doing? Or, right there are people who are like living in tents in the desert, or there are people who are, out clubbing, or there are people like just like the sheer variety of human experience is kind of awesome to me.
Wow, it really is awesome.
Yeah.
Humans are awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. And yeah, I think last time we talked, you talked about your dissertation and the different areas you went to study
Hmm.
humans.
Yeah.
So yeah, perhaps it had quite a big impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you wrote a wonderful, wonderful book here on radical listening. I talked about the devices and the loneliness that are impacting children, but also adults. I think we're having a harder and harder time listening when, oh, yeah, our brains are just almost becoming wired to have quick, short pieces of information, and that like deep, sought after conversation that really feels good, unfortunately, isn't the norm anymore. But with tools like your book, I think you're trying to reclaim that. And I was very drawn to this book and enjoyed reading it. Before you started writing the book, you and your co-author Christian, what was the? I mean, you talk a lot about intention, and we'll get to that. But what was the intention before any pen went to paper of why this was the time to write this book amongst many other books you could write?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Great question. So you could think of communication in general as a technology that our ancient ancestors kind of created to
Mm-hmm.
interact, right? And that includes speech, but it also includes technological innovations like writing, more recently, social media, right? But these are all just ways that we can interact with one another. But you might say, like, for as long as humans have been around, like, have we really improved the technology of listening? And many people will be familiar with active listening, they'll be like, and it's
Oh,
and it's almost like, well, what were people doing before active listening? Because active listening, is pretty recent. It's only 50 years old or so. So, like, how was our listening before that? And in particular with active listening, I mean, I saw your response there. I've always been pretty, I don't know if irritated is the right word, but let's just go with that. Like, irritated by active
yeah.
listening. And, one of the things is this sort of parroting back of what the person says. Like, oh, I hear that's really hard for you, when they've just said, that's really hard for me. And
But they don't care. Like,
yeah.
no, I shouldn't say that.
It occurred to me that I never do that in my organic friendships, that somehow we're supposed to do that at work. But I would never do that with a friend. Like, a friend would come over and be like, I just broke up with my partner. And I'd be like, wow, it sounds like you're really struggling because you just broke up with your partner. Like, I just am trying to get across to my friend that I'm listening to them in so many more sort of organic ways. And so I was like, I think we can improve listening as a technology, and that should start by improving our understanding of the various dimensions of listening. And I'm an executive coach. Christian, my co-author, is an executive coach. So we spend a lot of time listening in a professional capacity. It was an area of mutual interest for us. There are a few books on the topic, but we thought that we might have something new to say on it. And that's how we decided to start taking our first steps forward.
I recall going into one of my first corporate roles, and they were doing what they called coaching with active listening. And it was exactly what you said there, this parroting back what I just said. I'm like, I know, I just said that. And
Yeah.
I never found it like it was effective. I didn't feel like I was being heard, but I'm glad that you guys felt the same and wrote this book. And it really seems like you mentioned about what we're doing before active listening. Ancient wisdom, I mean, a lot of it is around true connection, whether it's, we could find different, whether it's Stoicism or Buddhism. There's deep-rooted rituals to create this connection, and somehow it turned into active listening. They would not be proud of that. How much of this book, Radical Listening, is centered around this idea of like true connection?
Well, that's a subtitle, certainly. So it's right there on the cover of the book, The Art of True Connection. And that was
deep question. Hey, I got it right off the cover of the book.
Yeah, exactly. That's what Christian really pushed for, that because Christian, he was raised by a Japanese woman, and it really is about kind of polite listening. He and connecting through listening is really important. If there were types of listeners and he listened to you, I would call him a respectful listener. Like if you interacted with him, you'd be like, wow, this person really respects me. Like I just come across just feeling validated if I interact with Christian. And that's different than different other kinds of listeners. We believe that listening is a start. I'm not here to say it's a panacea. I'm not a guy that wrote a book and I'm like, and listening is going to solve the world's problems. If we just did that, all the things you're complaining about would go away. I do think a lot of them would be improved. I do think the world probably needs more listening. So somewhere between it's going to solve everything and we're doing it just fine is where we're positioning our thinking, which is we can do it better. And if we do it better, things will go better. And part of that will be we'll feel more connection. And the time is right for that, because as you've mentioned 2 or 3 times now, the word loneliness, the word, conflict, loneliness, like all this social disconnection. It's a time that people are hungry for connection, I believe.
Yeah, that idea of connection. And I think that what you offer up is this tool, as you we're talking about the ancestors used listening as a tool, this is a tool, yet when you do this tool, it opens up different pathways. And I'm not just making this up because I'm trying to be polite and people think Canadians are polite. We're not always polite. But when I was reading this, my wife and I had a disagreement, and I actually stopped and I just said, well, like, what is the intention of this conversation? Like, do you want me to hear you, or are we problem solving? Are we trying to collaborate? And what may have avoided an escalation turned into like a genuine connection, and then it opened up pathways for more things. So tools can open up new pathways or doorways that we might not have expected.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned this with your wife. I was reading some research by the linguist Deborah Tannen, and she's great. She'll just take these actual conversations, and one is with her husband, and it's the kind of conversation that everyone can relate to. It'll be like both people are kind of silent, and one person will, look up from their book and be like, "You want to go to dinner tonight?" And the other person will be like, yeah, okay." And then be like, "Oh, cool. What do you want to have?" "I don't know. What do you want to have?" And then she goes back through and she'll say, like, how is each party interpreting that interaction? Mm-hmm. So the one person who offered it in the first place, "Hey, you want to go out to eat?" is kind of saying, "I think you've had a hard day and I don't think we should cook at home, and I think it would be easier for you. So like my gift to you is that I'm offering the chance to go out to eat. But the other person interprets it this way. Oh, my partner really wants to go out to eat. So my gift for them is to cater to them. And so we should definitely go to where they want to go because they're trying to hint that they want to go out to eat. And just this sort of like cascade of misinterpretations. And it turns out neither of them really want to go out to eat. But they're both trying to do it for the other person. They both end up kind of fighting about where to go to eat. They end up going out to eat. Neither of them enjoys the meal. They could have easily avoided it. And we've all been in so many conversations like that.
And they both leave being like, I did it for you.
Yeah, totally. So, and this is where I'm like, maybe the technology needs an upgrade. Like maybe we should be adding like a patch to it. Like if you think of it, like if conversation is our software, like it needs a patch.
Mm-hmm. Well, much of this patch is driven around the intention. Can you, we've kind of danced around the intention, but can you specifically bring up why you guys decided to narrow in on the intention part within the radical listening?
Yeah. So I'm going to say it in a big way, and then I'll say it in a pithy kind of soundbite way after. So the big way is the mistake people make about listening is that we're just sort of listening to everything. We're like a radar dish. And I'm just like taking in all this information from you. And that's what listening is. I'm listening to your tone of voice. I'm listening to your word choice. I'm listening to the content. I'm kind of listening for what your motive is for saying this. Maybe I'm listening for your cultural background. Maybe I'm listening for your mood. I'm taking in your facial expression. And the truth is we can't simultaneously attend to all of that. It's just not the way attention works. We might be able to shift between some of those, but attention is just a bit narrower. And if you're going to have this sort of like more narrowed idea, you might as well be focusing the spotlight of attention on something specific. And that is our intention. So some people go in with an intention to solve a problem, for example. My friend comes to me, I just broke up with my partner, and then I start giving advice. And it's because I'm listening through this intention of solving. But that may or may not be what my friend wants. Classically, my friend just wants to be validated. And if I was listening to validate, that would be a completely different type of listening. Or maybe I'm listening to distract my friend. So I'm more likely to make jokes or say funny things. And our idea, and this is the pithy part, is that your intention for listening guides your attention. So there's some pretty common motives for listening. And what that motive is actually guiding what you're paying attention to. So I'll give you a quick example. Listening to entertain, people who are funny are like, yeah, I am tracking the conversation in order to make some jokes. And what people who are funny are doing is they're listening for pauses, because pauses are where jokes go, because humor is about timing. And so they are paying more attention to pauses than you might if you were listening to validate someone, or if you were listening to learn from someone. If I was listening to learn from you, I might be listening for keywords or concepts or connections between main points. And I would pay almost no attention to pauses. So once you start thinking about this, you're like, wow, my intention for the conversation as a listener is actually just guiding my whole perception of what's being said. And I'm missing some information and I'm emphasizing other information.
Hi, it's Shaun. I know I'm breaking into the conversation just for a moment. There's good reason. If you're here, it means you care about living with more purpose, more meaning, and deeper connection. And that's exactly what the You Potential podcast is all about. When you hit that subscribe button, conversations like this, the ones that challenge you to think differently and open to new possibilities, keep showing up to you every week. And when you share this episode with someone you care, you're not just passing along a podcast. You're giving them a chance to reflect, to grow, and maybe even to reimagine what a good life can look like for them. So please take a second, subscribe, share it with a friend. Let's spread the conversations that truly matter. Now back to the show. Very, very interesting. So you mentioned like if someone is humorous, I don't know if you said looking or listening. Maybe I wasn't listening, but you said listening or looking for.
Yeah.
And this new way or this alternative way of thinking or listening, radical listening, are you saying that maybe we're not listening for or looking for that? We're rather just absorbing based through the lens of our intention?
I think that you should be aware of what your intention is.
Right.
And aware that you're not absorbing everything, that you're getting a skewed view. In the same way that, three friends can go see a film and walk out of it, and one of them is like, that was terrible because I hated the story. And someone else is like, oh, but that was great because did you see the sets and the color and the filming and the photography?
Mm-hmm.
And someone else was like, oh, I liked one actor, but not another one. They're kind of like each emphasizing a different aspect. And that's what happens in conversation. And the classic thing we all know, and I just alluded to it a moment ago, is when one person just wants to be heard and validated. Like they just want to complain and hear that they're right.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're trying to do is like solve their problem and give them advice. And it's a misalignment. So part of what you're doing is just being aware of your motive for listening. You're also kind of saying, does this also align with something that would be useful for the conversation? Would it be useful for the speaker? So those people who are listening to entertain, some jokes are good, but they're also kind of listening for, am I taking it too far? Are there moments in the conversation where jokes are less appropriate, where there's a bit more serious tone, and then I can get back to jokes later? But knowing your intention is the basis for all of that.
I guess it's like dancing. If one person wants to do a two-step and the other one is trying to do the polka, it's you're not going to co-create this mutual connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've mentioned these sort of casual examples, going to see a movie, going out to dinner, your friend is going through a breakup, but this happens professionally as well. I know your background's with financial planning, and you might think, oh, I've got a kind of a standard intake. We want to look at our clients, the whole portfolio. We want to assess their risk tolerance. We want to think about their age. We want to get their retirement goals and their spending goals. And we have some kind of standard stuff that would guide what we might think of as like a typical financial planning conversation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that great listening is happening, because you might be listening for one particular narrow thing. Like I'm just listening for the key words, dollar amounts, risk profile, retirement goals, but I'm not listening for tone, for emphasis. Like, were they particularly excited about one goal versus another? And I might be missing just like that aspect of it. So I'm not suggesting that financial planners are poor listeners, but I'm just suggesting that you can always turn the dial up.
While you might not be suggesting that, observationally, I've noticed that we are very poor listeners. And, where my thoughts are going here is like, as many things in life, how we show up, we hold presence is informed by our experience, the experiences, the training, the life circumstances that we've all gone through, and that's how we see the lens of the world. And often it's this industry was from a very sales focused culture. And so you put on these lens of glasses that are like, listen for like exactly what you said. And if I hear it, it's like, yeah, I'm in. Yeah. Meanwhile, we're talking to someone about this highly emotional thing called money that they don't even really recognize actually that it's so much linked to their emotions, money, and how they behave with it. And we just don't listen to, I'm generalizing here, but we have a propensity not to be good listeners because, the lens that we are, I don't say given, the lens that we have wasn't from like a radical listening perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to, I mean, part of the listening is you have to have just this positive intent in general. Like, I really feel positively disposed towards the person. I want this person to get the most out of this conversation. I want this to be a connected interaction. This isn't about me making a sale. This isn't about them just getting a service. There are only two people in the room right now, and it's the two of us, and we need to like really be as sort of present and connected as possible on the circumstance. And then you go through these kind of common motivations. You know, there are things like, am I listening just to understand the person? And that'll orient me in a different way. Am I listening, and this is a related motive, to learn from them? And that will help me extract certain information. And I mean that in a very pro-social way. Am I listening to validate their experience? And when you could even shift between those in one professional interaction. But the more you know what you're doing, the more effective you'll be at each one of those, and the more connected the conversation will feel.
Robert, it seems like you're talking about those 6 intentions that you bring up in the book, the 3 social and 3 cognitive one. And I think that was a big part from the book that I hope people can go and get the book, because around this intention, I like how you broke up that we have these different lens on like what type of intention we're having. And as someone who talks to a lot of people, I really found it beneficial to be like, wait, am I connecting in this one? Am I trying to just show, if it's a friend, like, am I appreciating you? And like, even right now, I'm trying to connect. I'm trying to learn from you, but I also am trying to navigate what the learner wants or the listener wants to hear.
Mm-hmm.
But it's neat how you can bounce between them. The benefit that I see is that knowing what you're doing, like knowing that, here's my intention. And maybe Robert, or the listener who or the communicator I'm communicating with, feels that.
Yeah. In a way, it's like maybe like ordering a meal at a restaurant. You're not like, oh, just bring all the ingredients out and I'll just start eating until a couple things taste good together.
Yeah.
You're like intentionally, you're like, I choose this because I'm looking for this kind of experience. And that's essentially what you're bringing to a conversation. Like, I choose this. And realizing it actually makes you more powerful because you have some control over the conversation. People, again, just think listening is receptive, but you're half the conversation, right? Listening, when you do this, I'm like, wow, I do understand better what your tone of voice is, where your excitement is. I have spent some time trying to understand your point of view. It makes me more accepting of you. That in turn will make me more validating of you. And it really improves the technology and the ability to use the technology. Although I will add this, you don't have to listen. And I want to be careful about saying that because, you know, I think people hear how passionate I am about listening and they're like, oh, he does think it'll save the world. I think you only need to listen to someone if you care about establishing a relationship with them or maintaining a relationship with them.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
if you don't have those two criteria in mind, you don't care about ongoing connection with this person, I don't think you're under any obligation to listen. It would actually be pretty costly to fully devote all of your attentional resources to listening to every single person who comes across you in life, especially if you don't really care about them, right?
You know, your answers are just, they're hitting home with me. And I say this again, I'm not saying this because you're here and I'm trying to be polite, but this book has really changed how I'm conversing. And I was over at someone's house the other day, some hockey stuff I had to drop off and through volunteering. And this person asked me if I wanted to hang out and have a quick beer. So I said, sure. We were in their garage and I've known this guy for like 5 years. No idea did I ever know he was like really into motorcycles, like really into motorcycles. There's this chopper in his garage that he built. And like I had zero indication that he knew how to change an oil, let alone build a motorcycle. I have no idea how to change oil in any sort of automotive. But I started asking him questions, and I'm serious when I said I decided to learn. And I was actually fascinated with how much flow this guy got. He doesn't touch it very often anymore because he's busy job, kids, but he just went into flow, like explaining the tires, the seat, where he got this paint from. An hour and a half flew by, and I was like, wow, I was impressed. So I went on with my day, but then I got a text from him and he's like, thanks. That was a great conversation. I needed it. And I went into learner. Like, I didn't try to like peacock, be like, oh yeah, the carburetor. But
Yeah.
anyways,
Or draw it back to yourself, like, oh, well, but, I went on a motorcycle ride one time, or, something like that. And that's exactly what you want. When he's like, that was a great conversation. Imagine that every time you exited a conversation, that's what the person said. Like, wow, that was a great conversation. And I think that more or less is possible. My co-author, Christian, says this about exactly the circumstance that you were in. So many listeners, I'm guessing, here will hear your story and kind of be like, that sounds awful. Like, for an hour, like, some guy's going to be talking about a motorcycle to me. I have no interest in motorcycles. I got to hear about carburetors and engines and whatever. Like, and Christian would say, first of all, it's helpful if you're just interested in a bunch of stuff. That makes it easy because then you ask questions and all that.
yeah.
But he said, even if you're not interested in the topic, you can almost always be interested in the person.
Yeah.
And that leads to the questions like, how did you get into motorcycles? What does working on motorcycles, do for you? Like, how does it benefit you? What have you learned about yourself through motorcycles? And almost everyone is a little bit socially curious. And that also leads to the sort of same connection.
I like that answer, and it kind of leads off of what I guess incited me to share that story is when you said you don't have to listen to anyone. Maybe it's someone you care about or you want to have that connection with, and that was the case with this individual. And it also gave me, though, permission. There's been times where I'm like, I just don't want to listen, and my wife's like, you gotta be interested, but I don't know, it borderlines people pleasing. That's what I've always told myself.
Well, that's right. And, kind of the classic example is, you meet someone in a very casual circumstance. They're, a friend of a friend, and they don't hold the same political beliefs or values you do. And they're kind of droning on, this is how you should raise kids, or this is how you should vote, or this is how the government should operate, or whatever it is. And you're not, you might sort of be half out of the conversation, kind of like, I wish I weren't in this conversation, but I'm going to be kind of like smiling at you politely. But you're really not under much obligation to like invest heavily in that person. Yeah, I certainly think that people should be polite, be very civil to one another. But that's different than like really listening, because really listening is a little more costly. You do have to kind of consider their point of view, open yourself to how did this person arrive at this? And you just don't want to do that with everyone.
Yeah, it takes energy. Now, for listeners, we have many different types of leaders, business owners who want to get better at listening. You talk about these 6 skills, 3 internal, 3 external. Due to time, we don't have time to go into every one. Based on what we've been talking about, I would like to pick one, and maybe you can add what I'm missing. But earlier you talked about, I think it was when you're talking about Christian, where you almost said like unconditional regard, or you have to, when you're listening, you need that acceptance is what I know one of the skills. So maybe can you touch on that one to start of one of the internal skills?
Yeah, so I will. If you would have asked me to pick 2, that one wouldn't have been it.
Oh,
but let's do it.
I think it's because I need to practice that.
The reason why I would have avoided it is because I think it's the toughest of it, right? Because it's like, just accept people, like, duh. Like, if we could do that so easily, we would all be doing that. Acceptance is one of the hardest of all of the skills. So a couple things about acceptance. When you accept another person, it is not the same thing as accepting their point of views or their points of view or their values. It is accepting their right to have a point of view. And that is where like the effortfulness comes up, because you have to spend some mental energy kind of parsing those apart. Like, this person's attitude might be pretty odious to me. Like, gosh, it's like the ugliest thing they're saying right now. It's a real turnoff. And yet they have a right, they have a full life of experience and have arrived at this conclusion. They have a right to that way of thinking. And again, if you're invested in establishing a connection with them or maintaining a connection with them, you kind of have an obligation to think about their right to have that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the tricks, so far as it is a trick for me, is the idea of intellectual humility. So most people don't know what intellectual humility is. We all know what humility is. Intellectual humility is different. It's like a cousin. Intellectual humility is the idea that you don't believe the way you think are the laws of nature, that you recognize that your thinking is also just an opinion. You recognize that your own thinking is also just as biased as that person's thinking, that you also have your own values and a lens and a hot take on things. And that's all they have, too. Now, yours feels way more sophisticated, way more, accurate. It's unfortunate that they're, doing the news outlets they're doing because they're misinformed, and just how lucky it is that you're so well informed. But if you can just spend some time thinking, all I have is a take, and that's all anyone has. And my opinion's an opinion, and I happen to love my opinion. But once you get into that mindset, it becomes a lot easier to sort of accept the right of others to an opinion, even if you hate the opinion they're espousing.
To me, that is one of the most powerful parts of this whole concept. And yeah, we all absorb and recognize which ones speak to us. But for me, because I'm a human. I've been guilty of exactly what you said.
Oh yeah, so have I. I mean, we all have. We all have. And I'll say this, for the people listening, you've seen me try and do this throughout this whole interaction, where I'm like, I don't know if I have the answer. This is just my opinion. This is just something I think. And yeah, I think about this stuff a lot, but let's also not take it too seriously. Like, you have a right to arrive at your own conclusions. And I really spend a fair amount of time. That's not for show. Like, that's true. Like, I spend a fair amount of time trying to recognize that although I'm a reasonably smart, thoughtful person, the world is full of reasonably smart, thoughtful people.
I have found that there are times where, and maybe it's I don't know, immature conversational style that I have, but I may ask people who are very deeply, like very committed to a certain research practice, and I 100% respect that. And if I go beyond the scope of that, and this could be a fault of my not setting expectations beforehand, but it could be just like, I'm not going to answer that, and I'm totally respectful. I felt that in this conversation, and then like, oh, he took it, he's doing it, he's giving me an answer, and I feel like it was okay. I don't know if it was, but anyhow, I felt that when you did it, so I appreciate that.
Good, thanks. Yeah, so that's the skill of acceptance, I guess.
And it makes me think of improv. I don't do improv, but I know in improv, like, when people are acting, it's we don't know what you're going to do. And there's this rule called yes and. Mm-hmm. And so it's like accepting, like, yes and then they do their own version of improv. And it seems to add fuel to the conversation.
Yeah, and I think improv's a nice metaphor for the conversation. In fact, many conversations are improvised, right? Yeah. Unless they're, how are you doing? I'm fine. It's like a very scripted kind of interaction. But one of the things in improv theater is that you're trying to make the other person look good. It's not about showboating. It's not about, oh, can I just put the funny zinger in here to make the audience laugh? It's, I also have an obligation to my scene partner to continue the scene, to set them up for good things, right? So we're really, not only are we aligned, but we're trying to do the best for one another. It's quite cooperative.
Mm-hmm. And when you do that in a conversation, it feels good.
Yeah.
So we talked about acceptance. I see we're coming to an end here. I don't know if there's one more you want to touch on to wrap up the skills section, but I'm an advocate of this book. I think everyone needs to go get the book. You find out all 6 of them. But yeah,
Yeah.
what would be one more you'd offer up?
I would offer up, and it might sound kind of obvious or maybe counterintuitive, and it's questioning. Now, the counterintuitive part is that when you ask a question, it seems like you're speaking, not listening. So, like, how could that be listening, right? We think of listening as silent. And I think of listening as just your half of the conversation. But what a question does is it sets you up for more listening. I'm teeing you up to talk more. And it's an opportunity for me to influence the conversation, because what question I ask you will lead the direction of the conversation. It might lead to something where I have more interest, where we have more connection. And so I think just asking lots of questions, it is intuitive for many people to think that the best connection will happen if you're telling me something, oh, you volunteer for hockey. The best connection would be if I then tell you my story. What do I volunteer for? And look, we're both volunteers, and that's our connection. But the truth is, I think there's better connection when I just ask you more about it. How'd you get involved with volunteering? What does volunteering provide to you? What's your own hockey story? Right?
I'm like, do you want me to actually tell you? I know you're not actually asking me, but I'm like, let me tell you. Because, and then you talk about a bit in the book how we can, with the interjections, how we can take over the conversation. And it seems like you bordered line there. Like you could say like, oh, where I live, I volunteer in the hockey board too, and I've had this experience. Instead, you did a really subtle but profound shift by deepening the questioning to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just to take it back to Christian, my co-author, he does a really nice version where he blends the two, where let's say he also does some stuff with hockey. He might just interject that real quick and say, oh, I also play hockey, but I want to hear all about your volunteering. And he just puts it. So he's like planting a seed, like, should we want to go that way later in the conversation? We can. But enough about me. Let's get back to you, Shaun. Like, I'm anxious to hear all about your hockey stuff.
That's great. It really sounds like you have a lot of respect and appreciation for Christian.
Yeah, very much. It's great because our communication styles are so different. I'm a big talker. I'm an interrupter. He's very kind of polite, respectful, wait your turn kind of speaker. And yet we learn so much from the other person's style, i.e., we accept each other.
That acceptance. It seems like it in a similar thought as Jung's our unconditional positive regard. No, I think that's more on the therapy side, but this idea that, positive regard, I benefit the doubt, I accept you.
Yeah. And I don't know, in everyday life, if it needs to be kind of unconditional, right? That might be a tall order, but just positive regard.
Yeah.
People can be a bit critical, oh, what's she wearing? Is she being fake? Whatever it is, is this guy standing too close to me? Is he aggressive? Whatever. And instead, just kind of like, what's awesome about this person a little bit? I like to think when there's people who I a little bit don't like, I like to think about how kids interact with them, because there's probably kids in their lives who do like these people. And I'm like, I wonder what those kids like about this person.
That's a good frame. Well, I've enjoyed our time. I see this the time has come to an end. For listeners, whether they're business owners, leaders, parents, fathers, mothers, whomever. What final statement would you say to kind of put this into a final bow on this conversation about deepening that true connection? And I'm going to say that you said a couple times that you're not going to pretend this is going to save the world. And, I agree. I appreciate the humility. Yet, I think this is a start, having true connections where we feel deeply heard and valued. So, yeah, what would you offer up to the listeners on closing the loop in this conversation?
Yeah. First, I would just thank everyone. If you're still here listening to us, I appreciate your time. It's a great, it's an honor that you're spending this time with us. I'm going to give you two-part advice, if you will. First, just to start thinking about listening as a theme. And, business owners, managers, like listening is a huge part of what you do, whether it's listening to the customer, whether it's, listening for what the problems are, whether it's listening to yourself, whether it's listening to the key people you work with so that you can work better. Listening is sort of the foundation of so much of what you do, the trust, the acceptance, the motivation, the coordination and cooperation, all the decisions you make. So just be having the listening lens on. And then the second thing is, if you really are going to try and, run the gauntlet of accepting people, here's a pithy little thing to remember. Everyone, absolutely everyone, is in the middle of something right now. And if you walk into a conversation thinking that about the person, because it's easy to recognize that in yourself, but if you can also recognize that in the other person, it can be helpful.
That is a profoundly impactful one for me. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Often we think it's just ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, Robert, I have a question that ends the episode that we've asked everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Let's imagine that you're at end of life now. However old you are, it doesn't matter. You find yourself sitting on a front porch and you pull out a notebook to write one last article, book, or message to your kids on what you learned was a key to have a meaningful life. What would that message entail?
Wow, you like to do the big swings and end big, huh? With the 20 seconds we have remaining, what's the secret to life?
Yeah. Well, I've got you, so I might as well ask.
Yeah, it's great. I was on the phone with a friend yesterday who said, "Hey, when are you going to come visit me?" He lives in a different place. And he said, "Before you answer, I just want to remind you of this. Unavoidably in your life, there will be a point at which you will be dead. And there's between now and that time to visit me. So when are you going to visit me?"
Oh, wow.
And so he was really putting a lot of pressure on me, right? Like,
but I mean, truth.
Yeah, but really reminding me of my mortality, kind of saying like what's important. And I think that's what I would suggest to people, that like your time is actually finite. And if you're not going to live your life, no one else is going to live it for you. So you might as well make sure that there's some stuff that you value, some stuff that's enjoyable, some stuff meaningful, and if that's not the rat race, fine. If it is the rat race, fine. But you oughta spend some time on the riverbank looking at the river and thinking about what part of the river you want to swim in, and then swimming in that part.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate your answer. It kind of circles back to what we were talking about earlier, midlife, and how it lets us know that there's finitude to our time. And your comment makes me think of the individual who I adapted that question from had told me. He does what he calls exquisite listening. He told me, you can ask anyone at any time because you get the real answer. Mm-hmm. And look at what came up. That was a wonderful answer. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. It was a pleasure to answer that question, and a pleasure just to interact with you. It was a great conversation.
Well, thank you. Robert, for the listeners who would like to get a copy of this book or other books of yours, and just general information where to find yourself on the internet, where would you point them towards?
They could go to my website, robertdiener.com, DIENER.com. Or they can just, in terms of books, they're everywhere that books are sold.
Well, it was a great book. It is a great book, and I encourage everyone to go get a copy. And thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it, and all the work you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did with Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. That just felt so damn good for me. In a world that we see, it's hyper-connected through different social media technologies. Despite this hyper-connectivity, we feel deeply disconnected. As we know, loneliness is at an all-time high, and our attention spans, our ability to focus, it's being hijacked by sound bites. Sound bites seem to be the thing we're all chasing. But if you're like me, we know the power of a real conversation, one that you feel heard, where the other person is actually listening. It's been a cornerstone of a life well lived. Humans, us, me, you, we've been doing this for decades, centuries. But we're not always great at it. However, Robert's work reminds us that listening is not just a skill we learn. It's an art that we need to practice, now more than ever. So, for this week, I've got a reflection that I'm pondering. When was the last time I had a conversation where I felt deeply heard, where I know the other person truly listened to me? Because sometimes it's not the answers we learn from, but the questions. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the show on Apple or Spotify. And if you enjoyed today's episode with Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener, you'll love episode number 11 with Dr. Todd Castian, where we explore how to build trust and connection with your kids through listening. Until next time, have yourself a great week.